Welcome to Instruction Discussion, our weekly look at the latest topics and trends in education affecting schools here on Long Island and schools around the world. Whether you're a teacher, parent, or student, listen for tips and strategies to help you navigate the educational landscape. There's a bell. It's time to start today's Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hello, I'm Kevin Boston Hill, and welcome to Instruction Discussion, where each week we will examine a recent trend or development in education and its impact on Long Island. The pandemic has been blamed for a lot of recent trends, from supply chain issues to unemployment rates. It has also shown a bright light on inequities that have existed long before COVID became an issue, namely inequities in access to education. Among these inequities, we have seen college enrollment decrease over the years. According to a National Student Clearinghouse Research Center report, student enrollment in post-secondary institutions fell by 1.3 million from 2020 to 2022. While the pandemic is one reason for the decline, it is not the only reason, as many people cite the growing cost of college as a major factor, a factor that has existed for years. Whatever the reason, students are looking for alternatives to higher ed to acquire the employment skills they need. Some of our past shows have focused on alternatives such as IBM Skills Build and the partnership between Amazon and National University, as ways people can obtain valuable job skills without the traditional paths. To help us understand the direction enrollment trends are taking and provide an outlook on the future of higher education, today we welcome Jennifer Lee, Chief Growth Officer of Photomath, which some of our listeners may be familiar with as a vital tool in their mathematics success. Welcome to Instruction Discussion on 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, Kevin. Thanks for having me.
No, the pleasure is all mine. I'm glad that you were able to carve out a few moments to speak with us today. So I want to get right into some of the questions that I have, and that's one of them is, how do you think that colleges and students will be impacted by kind of this shift in attitude toward higher education?
Yeah, I think you highlighted a change that we've been seeing happening for several years, even before the pandemic hit, right? Which is a kind of confluence of a couple different factors. One, you mentioned the growing cost of education and the tuition bills, which will potentially get exacerbated if we continue to see interest rates increase and financing education becomes even more expensive as we head out the next couple of years. Second, you mentioned is kind of somewhat distrust or questioning about whether or not those four-year degrees make sense and whether or not there are alternative pathways. I think this actually is reflective of the fact that what we've seen is knowledge itself and the relevant skill sets that students need to learn is changing so rapidly. So, we talk about like the half-life of technology. We like to talk about the half-life of knowledge and how that's also coming down. So I think gone are the days where you can expect to get a four-year degree and then, so learn for 4 years and then earn for the next 30 to 40 years continuously, right? Now you're going to most likely see a pattern where students need to learn a little bit, become economically productive, continue to upskill, learn new skill sets, gain new forms of knowledge, and then continue on working again. And that, I think, will also impact how we see enrollment rates and the types of course and offerings that make sense for students going forward.
And I think that's really important in this, especially at this time of year, because we're talking about, especially high school students, high school seniors are graduating and they're going into college, some of them, or they may be deferring, taking that gap year that we used to talk about and so forth. So what are some of the alternatives that students can be considering if the traditional educational route is not in their plans?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of, even before the pandemic, we started to see a lot of offerings for online certifications. Traditionally, the boot camps had a growing sense of popularity too. How do you focus on extreme, shorter periods of time, 3 months, 6 months, even 9 months, to really focus on a specific skill set and then use that to then go and earn for a while, right? And so I think we'll start seeing these alternative pathways continue to increase in popularity. I think also the externship or learning on the job will become increasingly important. But I will say amongst all this, regardless of what path a student is taking, be it a traditional 4-year or 2-year route or an alternative pathway, what is crucial and remains the same is that students continue to focus on the fundamental skill sets, right? How do you approach problems? How do you gather information? How do you evaluate information? How do you start problem solving? And math, we believe, is actually one of those key fundamental skill sets that is crucial to, regardless what you're trying to learn and what you will need to learn in the future, making sure you have those fundamentals down coming out of high school, as well as, as you progress into your whatever form of tertiary education you have, that those become an important part to focus on.
Now, of course, we know that there are students across the country that say, well, why do I need math? And when I'm not going to use math in this aspect of my life, I'm going into this field, so I'm not going to need it and this, that, and the other. But as you pointed out, is not the learning math for math's sake, even though math is everywhere. But it's not learning math for math's sake. It's really the skill of problem solving, that critical thinking that is developed through the study of math that I think we need to really focus on. And since you brought it up, one of the tools that I know some students may be familiar with, and I'm familiar with as well, is using this app called Photomath. So for our listeners who may not be all that familiar, what is Photomath and how does it actually work?
Yeah, so Photomath is the #1 math learning app globally. We've had over 300 million downloads of the app so far. And what it does is it allows students to take a picture of a problem that they're trying to understand and learn, and then uses like AI and computer vision recognition to understand that particular problem and provide the student with the relevant information to get step-by-step explanations and really start understanding, how do I approach this problem? Why am I doing these steps, right? So there's some procedural knowledge involved, making sure we actually teach the process of how to approach it, but really there's a lot of conceptually how and why do you want to approach and get support for these types of problems that you're trying to solve. So that's Photomath as a brief synopsis.
Wouldn't that be almost considered cheating if you're using this device, this app, you're just taking a snapshot of or picture of a particular problem, and it's giving you all the step by step on how to do it? So why do we therefore need teachers in the room if we're going to have this type of application?
Yeah, we actually find a lot of teachers like Photomath because what it does is it allows them to change the discussion from not just the rote memorization of steps to, focus on why are we doing the steps, or let's compare methodologies, right? Now with technology, we can show you can use this approach, or you can use, approach A, approach B, approach C to solving this same problem. Now we can compare them and talk about why we would take different approaches and which makes more sense for some learners versus the others. We actually find teachers tend to really like utilizing it as a tool, because that's what it is. It's a tool set within your learning, just like the internet is a tool set within your learning. Discovering and finding out how to approach problems, where to gather information, that's all appropriate. And where Photomath really actually helps is not to have students get focused on what are the exact steps, right? But that lets them kind of step back and say, okay, well, why am I doing these steps? And how do I approach this step in various different ways, as just mentioned? So, I think so much of those students' learning journey is not about the answer, right? The answer has almost no value these days because search exists, the internet exists, information, answers are abound everywhere. It's really about how do I get to that answer? And how do I think about the problem so I can get that answer? And that's really where a lot of our development at Photomath has been, thinking about the why and the how of how you approach these problems.
Now, my experience with Photomath is that I've used it or shown students at the K to 12 level of how to use it and how it can be beneficial for them. Is there a way that it can be used, or can it also be equally as beneficial for college students? Yeah,
so I think a lot of this has to do with the content that you're learning. As it turns out, most students entering into college are actually not prepared for college level math. So we actually find in the college age, there's still a lot of learning of algebra, basic trigonometry, fundamentals. So it's there to help you firm up that foundation at the beginning portion of college. But also we do push into higher areas like calculus, as well as starting to branch into statistics and other areas that are more advanced topics. So we definitely have a lot of users in the college range.
Okay, because I know that's going to be one of the bigger issues. Again, you may have students who are familiar with Photomath and they're using it currently in middle school and high school, But again, that's for your algebra, your trigonometry, and they may have a question of whether it is useful for that higher level of math that they're going to experience, such as a calculus and statistics when they get into college. So I'm glad you were able to clear that up for me. Also, I know it's easier, or again, my experience with it is that you can take that snapshot for straight equations. Can Photomath also be used for word problems?
The short answer is yes. Long answer is it depends on the word problem.
Okay.
And that's actually a lot of where we spend our time with our AI development, is how do we continuously understand more and more problem types to be able to provide a greater array of support. Because as you kind of talked about, as we push into higher levels of math, things like statistics and those areas, it becomes a lot less formulaic, and it's a lot more about the application of those formulas. And so we actually spend a lot of time thinking and in providing how do we increase that support and understand all types of problem, be it, a simple algebra equation like a quadratic formula, or a more complex statistical problem around probability, and confidence intervals. So the answer is yes, we will continue to be able to solve and help support more and more of those types of problems. And we actually listen a lot to students as to where they need additional support. So on that front, any feedback is always welcome.
What would differentiate Photomath from, say, a Khan Academy, the videos that students can look at where they will also show the step-by-step on how to solve a particular problem? Yeah,
the main difference is that we tend to customize it specifically for that student, for their problem. Right? So a Khan Academy video, while they are we have so much respect for Khan Academy, and they've created some great content on these videos that have helped a lot of students and parents as well learn subjects. It's fixed, right? It's static content that doesn't necessarily apply to your particular problem or let you look at the problem solved in many different ways. And so what we try to do is to say, hey, for many students who can't yet translate a parallel problem, right? They're just not there yet. Like they need a little bit more help to see the similarities between those things. Photomath specifically uses technology so that we can understand that specific problem with those specific numbers and help students approach their problem first. And then what we try to do is also understand what's the best way for you to learn that problem. Is it, step-by-step explanation? Is it more of an animated tutorial that lets you move numbers around? Do you want figures and graphs? Is there audio components to it? So it's a little bit more allows for personalization through scaling, through technology.
And since it is personalized that way, again, they're looking at the problem they have sitting in front of them as opposed to being taught from an example. Can they also record that so that they can view it at a later time? Or is there a way to save that explanation so they can actually view it later?
Yeah, so there is a history function. So anything that you have solved or liked or saved, you can go back and review at another point in time, because that always helps when finals rolls around, right? To prepare to review those problems that caused you the most trouble and were hardest for you to understand throughout the semester.
And here's a question that I'm sure some people are going to have. Is there a cost involved with using Photomath?
So the app itself is free. And I would say 90+% of our content is completely, free and available to all. And that's actually really important for us because we really want to ensure that high quality education and support is accessible to as many students as possible. We think that, you talked about equity earlier. We spend a lot of time thinking about how to ensure that our technology works on low grade phones. If you have spotty internet connection, all this kind of stuff, how do we ensure that we increase accessibility regardless of your access to broadband and high quality devices, that type of stuff. And then we do have a portion of content, though, that is part of our premium subscription, which goes a little bit deeper into explanations, which allows for a little bit more distinction on the whys and the hows of everything.
Thank you. Thank you. You are listening to Instruction Discussion on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Kevin Boston Hill, and our guest today is Jennifer Lee, Chief Growth Officer of Photomath. You mentioned a little bit about the access and the equity in education. And I want to focus on that just a little bit because I can see the applicational value of something like a Photomath in just regular teaching when it comes to higher education. So how can or have institutions of higher learning, colleges, universities, community colleges, have they been kind of embracing the use of tools like this to help their students?
Yeah, I think what we talked about is a lot of students aren't able to be full-time students, right? Or they have a mixture part-time. And so they might be working additional hours or need to take classes in those off hours. And might not be able to make things like office hours or TA support times, which might not coincide well with their schedule. And so in these cases, having digital tools that can be accessible 24/7 when students have the time and ability to study, I think is actually a really important part of the learning experience, and making sure that there is greater access and equity to support for students.
Yeah, because I know that there are a few schools, and I did an interview a few months ago with an individual who was in touch with, or who was researching at Georgia State University, and how that they did a shift in their whole thinking process as far as how they address the student. And because they went from the premise or the question, is a school serving the student or is the student serving the school? And I think when you look at it in that way, think of it as a school supposed to be serving the student, you really come up with a lot of different ways to address those inequities and to close those gaps that may happen. So I'm going to ask you, where might you see the role of educational applications such as Photomath and others to supporting underrepresented students in our schools?
Yeah, that's a great question, Kevin. I think it comes back to what I mentioned, which is flexibility, right? Making sure that we can meet students on their own time. And the reason why they're often underrepresented is because they face different restrictions and barriers and difficulties, which make the standard traditional format more challenging. And so I think going back, making sure that there's flexibility within the education system, flexibility to consume that education is the key here. And then, a lot of educational applications and digital tools allow for some of that greater flexibility.
And of course, along with badging and certifications and things of that nature, where do you see, or do you foresee the rise in education or in the usage of educational applications kind of moving in that realm as being an alternative pathway to obtaining those critical employment skills?
I think that being able to access, the right employment skills and to be able to signal that to the market, regardless of where you potentially are located, right? You don't necessarily have to be next to a big urban hub or a big tech center, is part of that process, which will help a lot of underrepresented students that come from various different geographies and various different backgrounds to be able to gain access, right? And I think the final thing is also the cost piece, which is how do we continue to reduce the cost of education for students? And more importantly, how do we continue to reduce the cost of high quality support and education for students? That is the important component. When we talk about, one of the things that's really common for us is we find that 70% of parents don't feel like they can afford, the private tutoring to help support their students in subjects like math, right? When it's $100 an hour, that becomes really cost prohibitive for folks. So how do we utilize technology to bring down that price point as well? So that instead of paying $100 an hour, can you pay, $10 a month or $60 a year to get access to tutoring like support for your students? And I think that's a lot of what we're also trying to do and focus on, is how do we not just make it more flexible and accessible, but accessible through cost as well.
And since we're talking about making these things more accessible, and we talk about how do we use or leverage technology to make education more accessible, what about those areas or those individuals who may not have, as you mentioned before, may not have broadband or may not have the high speed service that may be required to operate a particular application? What can we do to support those particular students and those underrepresented people as well?
Yeah, I think to some extent I've seen a lot of efforts, particularly over the pandemic at the school district level, and at certain citywide levels to make broadband more accessible publicly. And I think that those initiatives need to continue, right? So there's no replacement for it. What we want to do is provide access to everyone. And then I think the other key factor here is to make sure when we're building applications, we understand, well, how much data are we really using for this application? And are we minimizing it so that it's not costly for the student? So it's not just the amount of space that it takes up on your phone, but for every single interaction or usage of the app, we're not incurring high data costs for the students. I think that's another really big one, something that we always try to optimize at Photomath. And it's a technological challenge, but it's an important one.
And is there a particular, I guess, amount of power that a phone would have to have, or can they also maybe use their any other mobile devices to run the app as well?
Yeah, so we're available on a broad range of mobile devices, be they tablets or phones. The thing that you really just need is a camera.
Got it. So they can also, is there a way to download the app onto their laptop as well? But again, I don't know if not having a rear-facing camera would support it, but would the app be available on their laptops as well?
Currently, today, our app is not available on the laptop just because of precisely the reason you mentioned, which is the camera availability on laptops it makes it really unwieldy to, it's actually it's conducive.
Very
experience.
Clunky, yeah.
But at the end of the day now, I mean, mobile phones and tablets are such powerful devices that you can actually really suffice and get around utilizing those. It's not necessary to have a laptop or a desktop here to be able to access this.
And I know you mentioned before about that there is a subscription for the premium services. Is that something that maybe a school district or institute of higher learning can kind of tap into to be able to support that and supply this app to their students?
We are always open and happy to talk to school districts and institutions about that. So we're ready and available should anybody want to talk about providing it more broadly to their students at large.
So let me ask you about your background a little bit because I was always interested to see what path people took to get to where they are currently. So how did you actually get into your particular career to be that chief growth officer at Photomath? And what does a chief growth officer actually do?
Yeah, it's a good question. I get that question a lot. The chief growth officer, my role and responsibility is how do we continue to help the app grow up and to the right? How do we make sure it becomes more accessible to more students and that we continue to be able to grow our employee base as well as the service and be able to provide greater products and features to that growing student base. And my background's a little bit different. At Photomath, we have a lot of computer scientists and developers, AI specialists, math R&D, teachers. I have a little bit of a different background where I actually was an investor for 15 plus years prior to joining Photomath. And I came to know the team actually through an investment. And I just was so inspired by the mission and the work that the team was doing that I decided that I wanted to actually dedicate myself full time.
Okay. Well, that kind of helps our students out there. Let them know that there's always a path to get someplace. It doesn't matter where you begin. It's what your interests are and if you have a particular skill set, that will take you into whatever industry that you really want to go into later on.
Yeah, that's absolutely what we talked about. The knowledge and specific skills for jobs are changing really rapidly, but those fundamental skills of problem solving, analyzing, evaluating information are critical things to develop in your education because it allows you, like you said, to be flexible in your career and also adjust to the ever-changing landscape of jobs that will continue to happen.
Yeah, I think now the gap in employment that exists currently is because there are so many jobs that require a certain level of technology skill that a lot of people just don't have. So we're talking about those STEM careers and so forth. There are more STEM jobs out there than there are people to fill them. And so I think that's why a lot of people now are upskilling and reskilling themselves to be able to meet those demands. And I think that even years ago, I was always telling my students that there are jobs that we are preparing you for jobs that don't even exist yet. And that's kind of the case now, that there are so many jobs that the employment landscape is changing so rapidly and frequently that we don't know what types of jobs are going to be out there. We don't know what types of jobs are going to be needed. And so I think by having the opportunity for students to remain flexible to a certain degree, that will actually help them in the long run.
Couldn't agree with you more, Kevin. I think it's having that flexibility, but also having those fundamental skill sets, right, that you develop through some of the core subjects like math, critical thinking, analysis, problem solving. All those things will enable and be transferable into whatever next technical knowledge is necessary for, the next unknown name job. I mean, data scientist didn't even exist as an occupation 10 years ago, and now it's probably one of the highest in demand, highest paying jobs out there. So
let me ask you this, based on your particular experiences and your current positions and so forth, what do you necessarily see as an overview of the educational landscape going forward from 2022 and beyond?
Well, that's a big, broad question. What do we see about the overall educational landscape? I think the value of in-person learning was very much felt and understood through the pandemic, and I think that will continue to have its place. But it's still around how do we create additional personalized support around those in-person experiences, right? So how do we continue to personalize education using technology? How do we continue to use data to better understand how students learn and what pieces of information and styles of learning can help drive them to better understanding? And then we'll see, I think, a continued push towards these STEM areas, the critical thinking, mathematics, science, engineering, all those areas will continue to be pervasive and important within the educational landscape.
Yeah, I agree that I think it's really important that it's how we personalize the education going forward for each individual student that's going to be extremely important for their development and their preparation for the ever-changing employment landscape that's going to be facing them in the future. So, again, thank you for all of this information. It was extremely important. And we would definitely like to thank our guest, Jennifer Lee, the Chief Growth Officer of Photomath, for coming on to our show today.
Thank you so much, Kevin, for having me.
Once again, my name is Kevin Boston Hill, and thank you all for listening to Instruction Discussion right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.